I heard the crash before I saw it, and when I ran outside, my world shattered. My 12-year-old son was lying in our front yard, barely conscious, bones twisted at impossible angles. Standing over him were two men in fake police uniforms claiming to be HOA enforcement. What they did next changed everything, because they didn't know I have surveillance footage, a legal team, and a fury no parent should ever have to unleash. And soon, they'd be facing life behind bars. It started out like any other calm Saturday morning. The sun had just risen, casting a golden hue over the neighborhood, and my wife was making breakfast while our son Dylan was outside riding his bike up and down the driveway. We live in a quiet, gated community, one of those HOA-run suburbs that markets itself on family values and community peace. But that peace was shattered in a single instant that would haunt me forever. Was sipping my coffee when I heard the screech of tires and a loud thud. I bolted out the front door and saw a sight that no parent should ever have to witness. Dylan's bike lay in pieces, twisted and bent. Just a few feet away, my son was sprawled across the lawn, motionless, with his leg contorted unnaturally. Two men in black tactical gear stood over him, one still holding a baton, the other yelling into a radio. They wore uniforms that read HOA enforcement, but I had never seen them before. And more importantly, our HOA didn't have any authority to detain anyone, let alone beat a child. My mind raced. I dropped my mug and sprinted across the yard. The second I got close, the taller guy shoved me back with his forearm and barked, "Step away from the scene, sir. This is official HOA business." My rage boiled over. I shoved back, screaming, "You broke my son's bones, you psychos! Who the hell do you think you are?" Before things escalated further, my wife came running out and collapsed beside Dylan. She was sobbing, trying to wake him up, as I called 911. The HOA enforcers suddenly looked panicked. They exchanged a quick glance and started backing toward their unmarked SUV. But they'd already made a fatal mistake. Our entire front yard was under surveillance, motion-activated high-resolution video with audio, and it captured everything the moment they slammed their SUV into Dylan's bike, tackled him when he tried to run, and started swinging like he was a threat. Paramedics arrived within minutes and rushed Dylan to the hospital. 28 fractures, multiple broken ribs, a collapsed lung, a shattered femur. The doctors were stunned he was still alive. Meanwhile, the sheriff's department began questioning me. When I showed them the footage, their expressions went from disbelief to barely contained fury. "This wasn't law enforcement," one of the deputies said. "And this sure as hell wasn't HOA protocol. These guys are impersonating officers and committing assault on a minor." The sheriff himself paid me a visit that evening. A grizzled old Marine, he watched the footage 3 times in silence before quietly muttering, "We're going to bury these guys." But what chilled me to the core wasn't just the attack, it was the discovery that followed. These weren't rogue enforcers acting on a whim. This was coordinated. My family had been specifically targeted, and as I dug deeper, with help from a friend in state law enforcement, I uncovered a web of corruption, forged documents, and a so-called security enhancement protocol quietly passed by the HOA board, without any legal authority to enforce it. And the worst part? Dylan wasn't their first victim. The entire foundation of our safe, family-first neighborhood was about to collapse, and I was going to make sure I pulled every brick out myself. Spent the entire night at the hospital, sitting beside Dylan's bed, watching the machines monitor his every breath. 28 bones shattered, and yet somehow he was still with us. The image of those 2 fake officers slamming him into the ground burned into my brain like a looping nightmare. But I wasn't just angry, I was determined. These men had crossed a line, and I wasn't going to rest until I found out who they were and who sent them. The next morning, I started my own investigation. I had copies of the surveillance footage, and I began with the uniforms. HOA Enforcement Division, the patch read, stitched on with precision. The gear was tactical, all black, resembling SWAT attire but without any agency designation. No badges, no names, just intimidation gear meant to mimic real law enforcement. I called the HOA office demanding answers, but the line rang out. Dead. Their website? Under maintenance. Suspicious didn't even begin to cover it. So I visited the HOA's main office in person. What I found shocked me even more. The place was empty. Desks were overturned. Filing cabinets ransacked. The receptionist desk was abandoned, with shredded documents scattered across the floor like someone had tried to erase something fast. It was clear someone had cleaned house, probably after realizing how serious the assault on Dylan was. But they were too late. I already had the footage, I already had motive. All I needed now were names. A neighbor of mine, Carla, stopped me on the way back home. Her hands were trembling. "I saw them too," she whispered. "Two men. They were watching my house a few days ago. I thought it was just extra security. But now?" She looked like she'd seen a ghost. "They came by pretending to be part of a new HOA safety patrol. They said they were checking compliance. But they had guns. Real guns. This wasn't just an isolated attack. It was systematic intimidation. I drove to the county clerk's office and started digging through the HOA's registered documents. What I found made my blood run cold. 3 weeks before the attack, the HOA filed an obscure amendment labeled Community Protection Initiative, buried under financial documents. It granted temporary security authority to a third-party company, Civic Guardian Solutions. I had never heard of them. A quick online search revealed nothing. No website, no reviews, no phone number. But they were listed in the amendment as having full access to HOA grounds for the purpose of compliance enforcement and surveillance. And the signature on the contract? It was from someone who hadn't been on the board in over a year. A forged name, a dead number, and a fake company. I called in a favor from an old friend of mine who worked for the U.S. Marshals. After hearing what had happened to Dylan, he didn't even hesitate. "Send me what you've got," he said. Within 48 hours, he called back. "Civic Guardian Solutions isn't a company. It's a shell. No EIN, no tax filings, no office leases. Just a name on paper tied to 3 different fraud complaints in other states, and 2 of those complaints involve people dressed as cops." I was now looking at a conspiracy, a criminal impersonation ring using HOAs as a front. But why? For control? For intimidation? Or something worse? Then came the shocker. The SUV used in the attack on Dylan, it was found torched in a field just outside the city. No license plate, no VIN, scrubbed clean. Clearly someone wanted to cover their tracks. But again, it was too late. We had the video, we had eyewitnesses, and most importantly, I had the attention of law enforcement now. The sheriff's department began working alongside federal agents. My house was placed under protection, and slowly, neighbors began coming forward with their own stories. A woman down the block had been fined $5,000 for non-compliant mailboxes. And when she protested, she said 2 men showed up at her door, dressed in black, and warned her to stop causing trouble. This was no longer just about my son. This was about an entire community being manipulated, bullied, and threatened under the fake authority of a non-existent enforcement group. But they made one fatal mistake. They came after my family, and I wasn't just a father. I was a former military intelligence officer. And these thugs, they just started a war they had no clue how to finish. By the 3rd day, the community was rattled, and the walls around the truth began to crumble faster than anyone expected. I wasn't working alone anymore. Neighbors who had previously kept to themselves were now ringing my doorbell, emailing me late at night, and sliding letters under my door. Everyone had a story. Everyone had been intimidated. And suddenly, everyone wanted justice. It was Steve, an older man from 3 houses down, who cracked the first real lead. He'd worked in municipal auditing for 20 years before retirement, and after hearing about the attack on my son, He took a fresh look at the HOA's financial disclosures. What he found made my stomach drop. The HOA had been funneling thousands of dollars every month into external compliance operations. That in itself might have been passable, if not for the vendor names, several of which didn't exist and one of which had been flagged in a state fraud case 2 years ago. Even worse, the checks weren't signed by the current treasurer, but by a past board member who had resigned before the payments even started. And all those payments began roughly around the same time Dylan was attacked. When I took this information to the Sheriff's Department liaison, she brought in a financial crimes unit. Within hours, they issued subpoenas for HOA bank records. What they uncovered painted a disturbing picture. Someone within the HOA had been laundering money through fake companies, using those funds to hire hired muscle pretending to be law enforcement. And not just for Dylan's case. At least 6 other households had reported being visited or warned in the last 6 months. Now the big question loomed, who was behind it? I had my suspicions. One name kept popping up over and over again in board meetings, payment authorizations, and anonymous HOA memos: Gregory Talbot. He wasn't on the board officially, but he attended every meeting, was involved in every major discussion, and somehow had influence that extended far beyond a normal homeowner. He also happened to be a retired private contractor with deep pockets and no visible job. I'd met him once before. He smiled too easily, laughed too loudly, and always looked like he was calculating something behind his eyes. I started digging into Talbot's past. His name wasn't hard to find. He'd been sued twice in another state for harassment under a neighborhood watch program. Both cases were mysteriously settled out of court. When I contacted a reporter who had covered one of those cases, she said something that stuck with me. That guy doesn't operate alone. He forms little kingdoms, mini regimes within HOAs, and uses fear to control. Now it made sense. Gregory. Talbot was the mastermind behind the fake enforcement program. He'd created Civic Guardian Solutions as a front, hired ex-military grunts with checkered pasts, and sent them to correct anyone who challenged his imagined authority. And when the HOA board raised concerns, he threatened them with legal action or manufactured violations until they resigned. 3 board members had stepped down just months earlier. No replacements were ever elected. Talbot was running the show, quietly, unofficially, and ruthlessly. That same day, Talbot made a move of his own. I received a compliance notice in the mail, allegedly from the HOA, stating that I was in violation of 3 different bylaws and owed $1,150 in fines. My crime? Refusing to remove my surveillance cameras. The irony made my blood boil. I handed it directly to the Sheriff's Department, who confirmed it was a forged notice, not filed through any legal HOA channel. Talbot was panicking. He knew I was close. He knew law enforcement was closing in, but rather than back off, he escalated. That evening, my family's car was keyed, our mailbox ripped from the post, and I spotted a black SUV idling at the end of the block for nearly an hour. No plates, no movement. But what Talbot didn't know was that I'd been working with more than just local authorities. My brother, an FBI cyber analyst, had already begun tracking the IP addresses tied to HOA email threats and financial records. And guess what? They traced back to Talbot's home IP. Even better, the same network had been used to access 3 of the fake companies registered under Civic Guardian Solutions. We had everything now: motive, method, digital evidence, financial trails, and a mountain of community testimony. It was only a matter of time before this entire twisted empire came crashing down. Talbot thought he was above the law. He thought a quiet suburb was the perfect place to build his own little dictatorship. But he made one crucial mistake. He went after my son. By the time the courtroom doors opened, there wasn't a single empty seat. Local media had caught wind of the story: fake cops, broken bones, and a corrupt HOA. and turned it into front-page material. Cameramen lined the hallways, microphones hovered outside the courthouse steps, and protesters held signs demanding justice for Dylan. My son sat beside me in a wheelchair, his casts now gone, but the limp in his walk still haunting. This wasn't just a trial. It was a reckoning. The prosecution wasted no time. Their opening argument was surgical, laying out the timeline, the fake identities used by the hired officers, and the connection between Civic Guardian Solutions and Gregory Talbot. They even played security camera footage of the night. Dylan was attacked, blurred for privacy, but every shout, every thud, every scream echoed through the courtroom like a war drum. Several jurors flinched. One of them clenched her jaw so hard she had to excuse herself during recess. But then came the moment that shifted everything. The prosecution brought out Exhibit C, the forged credentials used by the assailants. They weren't just fake. They were built off stolen federal templates. That elevated the charges from impersonation to felony-level federal offenses. And one of the men who'd attacked Dylan? He had a dishonorable discharge from the military for assaulting a civilian while on deployment. That fact alone caused a ripple effect. Talbot's defense, already on shaky ground, started crumbling when their key witness, a supposed HOA compliance officer, admitted under cross-examination that he'd never even attended an HOA training session. When asked how he was hired, he claimed, "Mr. Talbot just said he had a mission. A mission." That word echoed in the courtroom like a bullet. This wasn't enforcement. This was a vendetta. And then it got worse, for Talbot. The FBI agent my brother had been coordinating with took the stand. With calm precision, she presented a map of IP logs, financial transfers, and metadata showing that emails issuing threats to multiple residents came directly from Gregory Talbot's home office. They even had timestamps, matching perfectly, with the hours Talbot was supposedly out of town. The nail in the coffin was a wire transfer from Civic Guardian's main account to one of the assailants the night after Dylan's attack. $2,500, labeled Field Operation Success. The courtroom went dead silent. Talbot's face finally changed. Up to that point, he had worn the smug grin of a man who thought he was smarter than the system. But now, his jaw tightened, his hands fidgeted. And when his lawyer leaned over to whisper something, Talbot didn't even blink. He was cornered. But the real shock came on day 4 of the trial when a surprise witness was called, the HOA's former treasurer. A woman named Carla, who had left her post abruptly months earlier and moved to another state. No one had been able to reach her until now. She flew in, escorted by federal marshals, and took the stand with trembling hands but steady eyes. She revealed that she had resigned because Talbot threatened her family. When she discovered the fake payments going out under her name, she confronted him, and he gave her an ultimatum: sign the checks or risk a visit. That night, her dog went missing, her car tires were slashed, and an anonymous email warned her that if she didn't comply, her daughter's school routine would be interrupted. She left town the next morning and never looked back. Her testimony broke the jury's composure. Some shook their heads in disbelief. One juror wiped tears from his eyes. The judge even paused proceedings for 10 minutes to let everyone regroup. Now, it wasn't just about my son. It was about every resident who had been bullied, every board member who had been silenced, and every person who thought their quiet suburb was safe from tyranny. Talbot had turned a neighborhood into a surveillance zone, a playground for his control fantasies. The final witness was Dylan. He stood slowly, with a cane in one hand and a defiant stare in his eyes. He didn't speak long, just a few sentences. But they hit like hammers. I was just walking home. I didn't yell. I didn't run. I didn't do anything wrong. But they tackled me like I was a threat, like I wasn't a person. And then he added, "But I'm still here." and I'm not afraid of you." The judge instructed the jury to begin deliberations the next morning, but no one doubted what would happen next. Talbot's empire of fear had collapsed, brick by brick, under the weight of truth. And this courtroom wasn't just a legal battleground. It was the final stand of a man who thought he could rewrite the rules of justice in his favor. He was wrong. When the verdict came down, guilty on all counts, a collective breath left the courtroom. It wasn't just relief. It was vindication. Gregory Talbot was found guilty of felony assault, impersonation of a federal officer, obstruction of justice, conspiracy, and multiple counts of wire fraud. Each charge carried weight, each one slammed into him like a gavel of reality he could no longer ignore. But here's the thing about justice. It doesn't always come with healing. Not right away. Dylan and I left that courtroom with more than a victory. We carried scars. Some you could see, like the long, pale line that still snaked down Dylan's shoulder, or the way he now hesitated when someone knocked unexpectedly. But others were buried deeper. Sleepless nights, flashbacks, the knowledge that someone could pretend to be the law and nearly destroy a young man's life, just because they could. Still, we weren't victims anymore. We were survivors, fighters, and that mattered. What came next surprised even me. Within a week of the verdict, our story had gone viral, picked up by national outlets, shared by veterans, groups, and discussed on talk shows. We were flooded with messages of support. But more than that, we were contacted by other families, people from all over the country who had been harassed, bullied, or assaulted by rogue HOAs and private security, forces operating with zero oversight. Our story wasn't an outlier. It was the tip of an iceberg. That's when I made a decision. We weren't going to disappear back into suburban silence. I teamed up with local attorneys and former law enforcement officials to launch a watchdog, nonprofit, dedicated to exposing corrupt HOA practices and pushing for legislation that would ban the use of fake or unregulated private security groups by residential boards. Within 3 months, our petition had over 500,000 signatures. State legislators started returning calls. One even proposed a bill called Dylan's Law, making it a felony to impersonate an officer under any HOA directive. Gregory Talbot's sentencing hit harder than expected. The judge, stern and unwavering, delivered the maximum, 35 years in federal prison, no chance of parole for the first 20. When asked if he had anything to say before the sentencing, Talbot remained silent. Not an apology, not a word, just that same smug look, only now it looked hollow, like someone who finally realized the bars weren't metaphorical anymore. But not everyone involved got away so easily. 2 board members resigned quietly, escaping. Public scrutiny, but not investigation. The HOA was placed under emergency federal audit. Their accounts frozen. Every single policy written under Talbot's reign was nullified. And the company he'd used, Civic Guardian Solutions, was dissolved within weeks. Their assets seized. Their executives indicted on multiple counts of fraud and racketeering. For our neighborhood, change came swiftly. Cameras that once lined. Street corners were removed. The community gates, once symbols of exclusivity, were dismantled. People who had been afraid to speak up before started showing up at meetings. Real ones, public ones. And this time, the agenda wasn't about lawn, heights, or mailbox colors. It was about healing, about trust. As for Dylan, he went back to college, switched majors to criminal justice, said he wanted to make sure no one ever went through what he did. I'd never seen him more focused, more driven. The boy who once questioned whether he'd walk again now walked into lecture halls like he owned them. And me? I started writing, telling our story, sharing the warning signs. I was invited to speak at conferences, schools, even a congressional hearing. At first, I didn't think anyone would care about what happened in a quiet little cul-de-sac, but they did. Because our story wasn't just ours. It was the story of a broken system finally being challenged. There's a myth in suburban America that HOAs are just mild annoyances, overzealous rule enforcers, people who complain about paint shades and trash bins. But that myth falls apart when power is unchecked, when people like Gregory Talbot twist that authority into a weapon, when justice isn't assumed, it has to be fought for. We learned that the hard way. But we also learned something else. The truth, no matter how buried, fights to surface. And when it does, it can shatter even the most carefully built lies. This isn't the end. It's just the beginning of something louder, something stronger. And if you're watching this and thinking, that could never happen in my neighborhood, you might want to look again, because all it takes is one fake badge, one unchecked ego, and one kid in the wrong place at the wrong time. But now, we're watching back. If this story shook you even half as much as it shook us living through it, don't stay silent. Share this video, drop your thoughts in the comments, and smash that subscribe button to stay locked in for more real, jaw-dropping HOA showdowns. This is the HOA Stories, where power trips meet their reckoning. Your voice matters. Your story could be next. Let's expose them, one HOA at a time.